Hello, everyone. We're back with another episode. I'm here with Nate, the usual guest, and the topic we're talking about today is the topic of Elon Musk buying Twitter. It was a pretty big piece of news this week, and I think it's kind of monumental. But yeah, there's a lot of mixed opinions on whether it was a good thing or a bad thing for humanity that he bought Twitter. But we're here to give some stats and our opinions on the matter to maybe clear some things up. And
Sure.
so, one quick stat that I thought was kind of important was that Twitter.com is the 9th most visited website in the world. And that means that many people, I think over 1 billion people, are using this platform to get their news, give their opinions, and talk to people through electronic means. And so it's an important site for discourse and just truth in general. And over the past, I don't know how long Twitter's been around, but
I don't know either, to be honest. Keep going.
but from what I can remember, Twitter has been a fan of liberal perspectives more than it's been a fan of conservative perspectives. And people who would promote conservative perspectives, they would maybe get banned or their accounts wouldn't be able to be seen by as many people due to the algorithms. And that was documented in quite a few cases, specifically this episode on Joe Rogan with the actual CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, and a representative of his, and this other guy named Tim Pool. But that episode really opened my eyes to see, like, there's a definite bias in the bureaucracy of Twitter. Well, there's a bias in any corporation, but when this corporation is the 9th most visited website, it can get a little interesting when it's shielding some views and really promoting other views. So Elon, I remember, well, he was tweeting and he said that he wants this platform to be a place where his friends and his enemies have just as equal amount of space to speak. He wants people who disagree with him and people who agree with him to be able to speak freely and learn from each other. And I think that's kind of what Twitter can do as the 9th most visited website, because so many people view it. And if anyone is allowed to give their opinions and be heard and be criticized, then I think the freedom of speech that will yield a lot of learning for everyone. So,
No, for sure. So let's take apart this claim about conservative bias real quick, because it's a lot of left leaning people completely disagree with this. They think that Twitter is not biased at all, or they think that the bias is simply not as significant as conservatives claim it is. And it's a fair argument to make, especially because there are a huge amount of high-profile conservatives on the site. I think one of the turning points in terms of the argument was when Donald Trump was actually banned from the platform.
yeah.
And to have the sitting president of the United States, regardless of what you think about him, let's put that to the side for a second, to have the sitting president of the United States banned from effectively the new town square for discourse in America was a monumental move. That was not a small move, and it kind of put a stake in the ground. It was a really cataclysmic move, and I think it brought attention to the claim of conservative bias. And you made reference to a specific Joe Rogan episode where Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, actually went on Joe Rogan, the biggest podcast in the world, which has more viewership than the top 10 cable news networks combined. It's absolutely insane when you look at the stats. He went on there. Kudos to him for going on. Seriously, good for him for going on. Brought a representative with him. And then he had on Tim Pool. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Tim Pool, he's a journalist. He's a internet commentator. He used to be a Bernie Sanders supporter. Politically, he's quasi-libertarian. He's an interesting guy. You kind of just got to go listen to him. But he's big on finding out the truth on complicated issues. That's kind of his thing. He wants to go actually figure out what's going on. The reason Joe Rogan brought him on for that particular interview is because Joe Rogan actually had on Jack Dorsey previously and got a lot of blowback. And I think a lot of that was warranted because he he didn't prepare properly and didn't give. He let Jack Dorsey go for a lot of his more roundabout answers. He let things go. He let things slip. And there's a lot of complex reasons behind that, and I don't want to get into it, and I don't want to criticize Joe too much. He does hundreds of these, and he's an incredible guy. But that interview certainly did not go as well as it could have. So he brought on Tim Pool because Tim knows a lot more about this particular issue and the specific cases and specific stats and specific facts about the way that Twitter utilizes its algorithm, the different high-profile people that they've banned, specific rules that actually lean in one direction politically. So if you truly want to do a deeper dive into whether or not Twitter is in fact biased towards the left, highly recommend that episode. I do want to make a brief case for why I think it is, in fact, left-leaning. I actually think, I don't know how you couldn't think that, given after watching that episode with Joe Rogan and the simple facts of the matter. So some of the basic stats we can just kind of go over here. So overall, Twitter leans left politically. So the majority of users on Twitter are left-leaning. And this is something that people don't really realize. Most people don't use Twitter. A small amount of people use Twitter. And of those small amount of people that use Twitter, an even smaller amount make up the vast majority of tweets. Yeah. This goes back to the Pareto Distribution, which we could do a whole bloody episode on. Mm-hmm. Essentially the idea that a small minority make up the majority of tweets in this particular scenario. And let's look at the actual distribution.
Most of the people on Twitter are normally just reading tweets, not tweeting.
Yeah, most people aren't tweeting.
Yeah.
But the actual distribution, I believe, is... So the top 10% of tweeters create 92% of the tweets. So again, going back to the Pareto distribution, a small minority are the loudest. And then let me take one quick step back. Think about it this way. Are you going to tweet about a benign incident, something completely irrelevant that isn't that interesting or whatever? Or are you going to tweet about a horrible thing that has happened? It's the same concept of like, okay, what's newsworthy? What's actually going to get published?
What's going to get clicks?
What is going to get clicks? And this is the big issue here, is truly what is going to get clicks. And generally, bad news gets more clicks than good news. Let's say you watch a video, and you thought, oh, that's a pretty good video. What's the chances that you're going to be the person that comments on it? You're probably not going to do that. But if you really hated the video, you very well might comment on it. So what happens is you get this poor sampling of the true reaction to content due to the fact that the extremes interact with that content more than the majority. And this happens all the time on Twitter. Mm-hmm. So you get these minority viewpoints that get all the attention, that accumulate all of the retweets and the tweets, etc. And that creates an incorrect view of the actual state of discourse in the US, online, the actual opinions of people in general, because this small minority of radical people are the loudest. And it, like I said, it causes this problem. So of the stats, let me go back real quick. The top 10% of tweeters create 92% of the tweets. Of that top 10%, 69% lean Democrat, 26% lean Republican. So certainly Twitter is a more liberal social media site. In fact, most of them tend to lean that way. And there's complicated reasons as to why that is the case. There's an echo chamber effect at play here, where you have, companies centered in Silicon Valley in a highly liberal place that happen to hire highly liberal people that then all get together in a highly liberal environment that then hear from other very liberal people, and you get this echo chamber effect of your views are never challenged, so you think you're the mainstream moderate view when in fact you are way on the left or way on the right. And this happens in both cases. What happens with a lot of these big tech companies is they are centered in very liberal cities. So they get a lot of liberal people that come in that have a more left-leaning perspective that then kind of dominate the company and dominate the direction of the company. So this has certainly happened with Twitter. To go back to the initial point, Tim Pool, Joe Rogan, Jack Dorsey, they kind of hashed this out. Do you have anything to say about that specifically? I was going to bring up a couple like high-profile examples before we get to...
I was just going to say, some people might be saying, well, Twitter has the right to do what it wants. It's a company.
Yes.
It's its own company. It shouldn't be regulated by the government. And who cares if the people lean conservative or Democrat, because that's their choice. We have freedom of political affiliation. And
Sure.
Why does it matter? And so you might ask that, and that's a pretty reasonable question. But like I keep saying, it's the 9th most viewed website. And so many people get their news from there. And if you walk into this platform, and most of the views you're hearing are loud and are radical, but you're seeing them as if they're the main view, your view of reality can almost be shifted. And if only one side of the aisle is being promoted, you're going to get a bias as well. And we see that with the elections last year, where if you posted anything to do with maybe a negative thing about Joe Biden or a positive thing about Donald Trump, it was probably going to get censored or just pushed to the side or not be allowed to be shared. And that's where this platform has the ability to...
That was quite the claim.
Sure.
I'm not even disagreeing with you, but that's quite the claim. Not in all cases were that occurring, but I know what you mean. There were a couple high-profile cases where that did in fact happen. But continue with your point. I don't want to cut you off.
I guess
that's a big claim.
The point I'm making is this is a platform where people go to speak, and if you have a specific set of values or political leanings, and you aren't even allowed to speak, it's no longer freedom of speech. And this is one of the largest platforms for freedom of speech. Ever since COVID, people don't get together as much. People interact online more, and so
it's exacerbated the problem.
And having mainly liberal views being promoted, it makes it. I don't know. The First Amendment isn't applied, and people aren't gaining the truth as much. There isn't as much of a discourse occurring, and
there's an inherent danger when one side holds the power in a discussion and actually can actively censor the other opinion. Oh, certainly. I'm totally with you there. Before we fully delve into that, and I want to get into that, I want to illustrate a couple high-profile cases of one of the reasons I think Twitter is actually inherently biased towards the left, which was part of the motivation for why Elon bought it. And it was a big part of it. And I want to get to what you just said, but I want a quick touch on this. So one of the big things that happened a couple of years ago was Meghan Murphy was banned from Twitter for saying, and I quote, "Men aren't women though." And it was in I don't remember all the exact context, but essentially it was a debate with some activist. And she, by the way, is a feminist journalist, is one way to put it. She's Canadian, high-profile feminist account online. So in that exchange, the rule that she broke, and this is fascinating, is she called... or she didn't specifically call, she just basically said that men aren't women. And, if you happen to be a rational person that, cares about reality, you might think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. Twitter has explicit rules against very vague categories. One of their categories is hate speech that they don't allow on the platform. Now, we're going to get into this in a second. But here's the tricky thing about trying to regulate something like hate speech. Who defines hate? Who defines what you can and cannot say? And that problem is illustrated perfectly with this example. Because 20 years ago, saying online, men aren't women, feel like a perfectly reasonable thing to say. Today, Twitter has a direct rule that puts in the category of hate speech.
Transphobia?
Yeah, essentially, I want to be careful with how specific I get because I'm actually not entirely certain, which is actually part of the point here, what their rules actually are. But basically, there's two things here. One, there's something called dead naming, which is where someone changes their name, generally in the case of, switching genders, whatever that means. And they legally change their name, and then you aren't allowed to, use their old name, generally in the context of harassment. And there's certain reasons for that, but certainly that's a very particular viewpoint, liberal viewpoint. But more specifically, in the category of hate speech, they put kind of an umbrella category of transphobia. And according to a lot of people, it's transphobia to call a biological male that claims to be a female a biological male. So to call, to use the, quote, incorrect pronouns based upon what that person identifies as is under that umbrella category. So there's been a number of cases, Meghan Murphy being one of the leading ones, where this has happened, where she was banned from the platform for essentially stating a biological fact. And there's more context here, certainly, and if you want to look into more of the context, you can look this up. They talk extensively about this with Tim Pool and Joe Rogan. The other big one that happened recently that I want to quick touch on was when the Babylon Bee, and then also the editor-in-chief of the Babylon Bee, whose name is escaping me right now, were banned from Twitter. And for those of you who don't know what the Babylon Bee is, it's essentially a right-leaning, meme-filled, trolling parody site.
Like satirical.
Satirical humor is what they do. They actually have a sister site called It's Not the Bee, which is actually specifically just like real stories. So they have one site that's for fun, essentially. It's one big joke that makes fun of the left and the right. More the left, fair enough, but that's kind of their thing. They just make fun of things. And they nominated Rachel Levine as Man of the Year. And the context here is that USA Today, I believe that was who did it, called Rachel Levine Woman of the Year. So they responded by calling him Man of the Year because Rachel Levine happens to be a biological man. Oh, and by the way, he happens to be the Assistant Health Secretary of the United States, which the further you think about that, the more crazy it gets. So we won't go down that particular train. But essentially they were, again, stating a biological fact and making fun of the fact that, I don't know, one of the biggest newspapers, journalist outlets in the U.S. was, calling a biological man Woman of the Year, which is quite the statement. So they were making fun of that fact, and they got banned for it, essentially. And that was one of the most recent cases. And then the founder / the editor-in-chief, I forget his technical title, of the Babylon Bee, tweeted about the fact that the Babylon Bee was banned and said, the context was, he said, well, maybe we need to, I forget what he said, something about the Uyghurs in China, the Uyghur Muslims, and it was, and then he got banned, and it was a fascinating little incident, but I'm going down a rabbit hole. I apologize. But the point is that there's a number of high-profile incidents of basic things that don't even seem conservative, that are just basic facts of reality, where people are getting banned for them. And I'm going to repeat myself again here, but if you want to do a deeper dive into whether Twitter is truly biased or not, highly recommend that. We could do an entire episode on that. But essentially, the case I'm making is that I think it is, and then that sets the stage for why Elon believes it might be beneficial to buy it and to try and make it a more free speech-centered site. And there's more there, but what were you
Yeah.
going to say?
Well, I was going to say, just imagine if you were in the place of, I don't know, high up on this bureaucracy of Twitter or another platform, and you were trying to create a policy within the company regarding hate speech, and you would be the one in charge defining what is hateful and what is not allowed to be said. And I don't know if anyone really has the power to make that call, because all of our experiences are so different, and it's just going to be subjective. Whoever's in power, that hate speech is just going to be different. It's whoever's above making the rules. So that I don't think hate speech and the First Amendment line up very well at all. Policies on hate speech and the First Amendment, because the instant you start castigating some speech as bad, you now are no longer allowing that freedom of discourse, because if someone has something dumb or stupid or hurtful to say, they'll say it, and then they'll have consequences, and they'll learn, and then better speech will update that speech. And I just think that having policies regarding hate speech can get dangerous, like we've been saying. And so I think Elon Musk noticed that maybe, and that was another reason why he thought buying it would be a wise move.
Yeah, I want to get to the free speech argument in like 10 minutes.
Okay.
So let's quick talk about the motivation for Elon Musk buying Twitter. So I made the case for why I think that Twitter is biased towards the left. I think it's very difficult to say that they aren't. Given that, there's more context here in that you briefly talked about this earlier in terms of the distinction between a private company and how exactly they are affected by something like the First Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a point that's brought up all the time, which is that, hey, they're a private company, they can do whatever they want, who cares? Make another Twitter, create another platform, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the issue with this is that, well, there's a couple issues with this. One is it assumes that there's a genuine competitive marketplace that is not monopolized that could actually produce a better version of Twitter. That simply hasn't happened. And Twitter, in terms of like looking at the stats, they truly do have a monopoly on this. The number of users on Twitter, where the discourse truly happens, is on Twitter, period. There are other sites that try to compete. They're just not even close. So one of the problems is that Twitter has effectively become the de facto town square for discourse. I mean, that was literally how the President of the United States communicated with the U.S. and the world for, the last 5 years, essentially, until he got banned. So this is actually a pretty big deal that Twitter's become so widespread that when you're banned from it, in some sense, you're actually banned from communicating with, your following, effectively speaking. And obviously there are other ways to do so. I'm not saying it's in totality the only way that you can communicate, but nonetheless it has become one of the only ways. So I don't want to go too far down this road, but this is a very important road to look into, in that right now there's a distinction between publishers and platforms in U.S. legal code. And the distinction is intentionally made because what happened initially when comment sections got added to websites and newspapers and things like that and different platforms, these platforms were potentially going to be held liable for what people said in the comment sections. And this was a really big deal because there's no way for a platform to truly moderate in any serious sense what people are going to say on their platform. Mm-hmm. So the idea was in the U.S. legal code, and I'm forgetting the actual name of the specific section of code, was that they wanted to make a carve out for platforms to allow the site not to be held liable if people said, untrue things or libel or slander or things like that. So that's the idea here. Mm-hmm. One of the issues that has happened is that the assumption that section of legal code made was that these platforms would truly operate as platforms, that they wouldn't censor certain views, they wouldn't promote certain views, that they would truly be an environment for free speech. The second that these platforms start to favor certain things over others or ban certain things that they don't like or literally happen to be true, they're operating more like a publisher. And a publisher like the New York Times can be sued if they libel or slander someone, or if they say something untrue about someone. They can actually be sued for that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a really big distinction.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a active battle going on legally and, you know, socially about how we should categorize these big tech platforms. And they've kind of hid behind this platform argument while at the same time acting as publishers in what they promote and what they get rid of.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of the issue. The other part of the issue is the fact that they become so widespread that, like I said, they're effectively the de facto town square of discourse and communication. And I want you to imagine the scenario that your electrical company said, oh, we're going to cut off your electricity because of your political leanings. They can't do that because there's something called common carriers. They legally aren't allowed to discriminate about those things. Sure, they're a private company, but we've universally recognized them as so important for your ability to function in society and in the US that there's a special carve out for them that says, nope, you can't discriminate based upon certain things. And one of the big arguments right now is that the same logic, and I tend to agree with this, should be applied to platforms like Twitter because they're so monopolized and they're so gigantic that they truly do have a monopoly on discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And if anything, should be protected from censorship or should be protected from the predations of censorship by a small minority, it certainly should be the place in which we conduct discourse. So this all sets the stage for why Elon Musk might want to buy Twitter. Because he, and if you listen to a couple of the different, he was asked in some panel about a week ago, like, what his plan was for buying Twitter and like why he would want to. I forget the exact clip. But he laid it out. He essentially said that Twitter's become such a influential place for discourse that the consequences of not allowing it to remain a free place are potentially exponential. And that it is critical for our survival as a nation and the world in general to have a place that we can go to discuss ideas without the fear of being censored. And I truly believe that that is a large part of his motivation for this. And he openly has said this multiple times. One of his first tweets after buying Twitter was that he said he hopes his worst critics stay on Twitter and his most avid supporters stay on Twitter. He wants more freedom in terms of the discourse on Twitter. And I think what we just laid out is all part of the reasoning as to why he wants this. Now, you know, I think he also wants the monetary potential of a company like Twitter, as anyone spending $50 billion should be concerned about. But nonetheless, his goals seem reasonable. And that kind of sets the stage for why precisely we would care so much about free speech and why that's so important. And you touched on that, and I'm going to let you keep touching on that because I just did a long monologue here.
Sure.
But yeah, there's an issue with defining what is hate and who defines that. And I don't know if you want to talk about that or whatever.
Sure.
If there are more comments here, but
because the instant that the people in charge define something as hate, you've now castigated a potential percentage of the population that might think this opinion, and then now they're not even allowed to say it. So now they can't even get the thought off their chest or say it out of fear, and they don't really know why, and you're not really learning why. Maybe it's bad, or instead of, okay, you're free to say whatever you want, and okay, I'm going to say something that might be hurtful, and then, okay, now you're going to get a little bit of backlash due to that, and other speech will tell you, hey, that was pretty dumb, and hey, you should not say that because of this. And if you're able to get your thoughts out, you learn so much more than if inside your head you're like, I kind of think it, but I'm not going to say it because I'm too scared to say it. And it kind of reminds me of, I don't know, 1984, where it's a book by George Orwell, where it's a fiction, but it reigns true in some places of today's society, where uh, the government has this is the government instead of a company, but the government has a monopoly on what can be said and what is labeled as hate speech, or what is labeled as truth, or what is labeled as lies. And no longer are people allowed to say what's on their mind. And that's what's yielded such a solid society, in my opinion. The ability for people to negotiate, say an idea, a person to criticize it, update it, and continue learning from each other. And the instant that you start having policies that say no longer are you allowed to have this opinion or say what's on your mind if it has anything regards to this issue, I think I think a society can degenerate into authoritarianism and chaos in some sense, because now people are no longer able to discuss, and people aren't learning, and now the only news they're getting are from the up tops. And I know that's kind of apocalyptic, but I see that in some small ways when Twitter says, oh, you're not allowed to say those few words in that order. You're just not allowed to. It's a bad thing to do. Don't say it. And I'm like, that growing up in America, I've been blessed to be able to say what's on my mind, even if it is stupid, because it can be updated. But if we live in a society that doesn't allow that to happen, I don't think that society will flourish. Yeah. So that's kind of my thoughts on free speech and also hate speech policies, and how they can be dangerous. And I'd recommend reading George Orwell's 1984. It kind of is similar to the scenario that I'm kind of explaining, but what do you think of all that?
No, it's a fantastic book, and it's a terrifying book, frankly, which normally is an indication that it might be worth reading. Now, you bring up a couple good points, and I want to... Free speech, in my opinion, is the cornerstone of Western societies and free societies. It is the pillar. It is the central axiom that we abandon at our peril. And I don't want to come down too harshly on the people at Twitter for genuinely trying to make a environment more conducive to genuine conversation. I think their motivation is good for the most part. I really do. Here's the problem, and this is the fundamental problem. You either deal with the consequences of allowing maximal free speech, or you deal with the consequences of trying to regulate speech. This is what a lot of people don't understand. There's no perfect solution here. You lose both ways. There is no Goldilocks scenario in which everyone sits in a circle and sings Kumbaya. It's not going to happen. So this is the key distinction here. There are problems with free speech. There certainly are. Horrible people are going to say things that are horribly wrong, immoral, and untrue. That's going to happen. Now, is that worth it? Well, the opposite is that you have certain people deciding what can and cannot be said. And even a brief reading of history, a small skimming of how exactly states degenerate into authoritarianism. The first thing that happens in all of these states is that they start to regulate what you can and cannot say. That is one of the first things, and it degenerates from there into a society where people are terrified to say what is true.
And to be individuals, or go.
To be individuals with opinions and to express those. It simply doesn't exist in those societies. And a brief look at the 20th century in the history of different authoritarian states, such as Nazi Germany, such as Stalinist Russia and Mao's China, and Cambodia. All of these states began with the active censorship of opposing viewpoints. And that is not to say that we are headed into a Stalinistic scenario. I don't think we are. But I do think that the more we mess around, the more that we take for granted the absolute miracle of this idea of free speech and this idea that every individual made in the image of God has something to contribute to the discourse and the order of a society. That every person has value and has something critical to say, and that we censor that at our peril. That idea is critical to the foundation of our Constitution, our values, our country, and has produced the freest, most prosperous country in the history of the world. And I think we take that for granted, and I think we think, oh, we have better ideas. We're enlightened now. We can create the perfect society. And there's a danger in that utopian thinking. So to bring it back to the initial point, I don't blame the executives at Twitter for trying to create a better space. But I don't think they take the problem seriously enough. You lose both ways. And the dangers of allowing a small minority of people to decide what can and cannot be said is a slippery slope. And I don't think we want to go down that slope. And I think Elon Musk, at a fundamental level, recognizes that danger and recognizes the need for a place that we can go to discuss ideas. And I'm not saying Twitter's the perfect place. It definitely is not the perfect place. But it is certainly a start, and it certainly, in a large capacity, has a monopoly on our current discourse in terms of as a platform. So I simply cannot emphasize how important free speech is, and I think at least part of the motivation for Musk doing this is because he understands that. Does that mean that all of it is? Of course not. Does that mean that everything's going to be perfect from here on out and that he won't make mistakes? Of course not. But it's something to consider, and it's something to consider for a long time that we should not simply forget. So there's my little speech about free speech, but I really do think it's important, and I simply cannot emphasize it enough. And what's so interesting here too for me is that I've been so terrified out of my skull about what happens when speech starts to be censored that it's not like what's the way to put this? It's not like I'm overly optimistic about, the fact that Donald Trump is on Twitter, that you have people, or was on Twitter rather. It's not like I think that all of this is going to be rainbows and sunshine from here on out. There's consequences to free speech. Don't get me wrong. But I've been so terrified of what happens when you regulate it that I'm stuck with the conclusion. I'm stuck with the problem of free speech, let's call it. And we abandon free speech at our peril. That is for sure. So, I don't know if you have anything more to say about that.
Yeah, one thing, we said that Twitter, it's a big mode of communication electronically, but it's not necessarily the most effective, but it is a large one. One thing that could support that idea is you only have, I think it's 280 characters or something along those lines.
Yeah, it's not much.
You can only say so much within a tweet.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think people will put out a tweet, say those 280 characters, and then be castigated and shamed and or banned or labeled as evil or all of those things. And whereas, who are you to be the judge and jury of a person who just put out a little bit of a paragraph? Who are you to say that you can say that, oh, they're just an evil person that should be canceled and they're not allowed to speak again? And I think that goes down into the whole idea of groupthink and us versus them,
Certainly.
and I think that's also a dangerous thing too. That I think Twitter as a platform sometimes just generates because of you can only say so much to someone,
Yeah.
and that's just
Precisely.
kind of reality. But when you have one side that is almost an echo chamber, where pretty much whenever you say something, you just get accepted and tons of likes and tons of shares, and if you're on the other side, you then are now labeled as the other side, the evil, and I think that's just a dangerous way to view the world, right versus left, evil versus good, us versus them, when in reality they're just an individual who's just typing up a sentence. You've never met this person. If you were in a room with this person talking and debating, you wouldn't then say,
yeah.
you're not allowed to speak ever again. Never again am I going to listen to anything you say. You might say that, but you no longer have the right to speak, and you're now an evil person who should not be associated with, and if any one of my friends found out that I was associating with you, they would cancel me too. And I think that's
There's a huge danger in that, and it's so easy because we're so this is the double-edged sword of technology. At one level, we're more connected than we've ever been, and at the other level, we're more disconnected than we've ever been because the discourse that we have is so foreign and so lacking in nuance and personability, if that's a word, that it's so easy to say things that you would never say to someone in person because it's such a not natural environment. What you would say to someone online versus what you would say to them in person is completely different things. I have this happen to me all the time when I'm trying to hire employees or when I'm trying to talk to someone over text. The difference between that and a phone call is gigantic, and the difference between a phone call and in person is pretty big too. So it always astounds me that yes, we're more connected, but that isn't necessarily a good thing on all these different levels. And you're pointing that out exactly. That there's a danger in that disconnected type of communication. So.
And it doesn't mean that communication is all bad.
No, of course not.
But I'm just pointing out a danger, and I don't use Twitter that much for my main mode of communication. I think talking to people in person is the best. But like I keep saying, it's one of the biggest visited platforms, and there's so many articles and podcasts and videos and opinions being shared, and it's such a great way to soak up information and learn. And so, but I'm just pointing out the dangers that this platform, no matter who's in charge, might yield, because you're almost incentivized to say something jarring and short and concise and non-nuanced, opposing them to try to get the upper footing. And I think it yields so many disagreements and debates that almost never end up in a productive manner. Sometimes I'll scroll and it's like one person has an opinion. Oh, there's a person who really disagrees. Oh, now they're arguing back and forth. Oh, it's just going on and on and on. They're never going to come to common ground through this thing.
No,
so,
of course not.
And I've kind of realized it is not a good idea for me to just go out and just, I disagree with you here on Twitter.
Yeah.
It's like, what am I going to solve here? My ego problem? Oh, they disagree with me. I don't know. My main point for bringing all this up is I don't think Twitter is the best place to be discussing, but I do think it's a place where you can learn a lot, especially if all kinds of opinions are allowed to be said. So.
No, exactly. No, I'm with you. One thing that I actively do with people is if the conversation is anything above surface level, I tell them to call me. And it's so funny because a lot of people, they hate that because they don't actually want to talk on the phone, which I think is a problem we all need to address because it's kind of pathetic. It's like, have a conversation. That's one thing that I've noticed to my absolute despair is that people are so bad at having conversations these days, in person specifically. And I think COVID just exacerbated that problem. But really, it's like a rule of mine that the second it becomes anything more complicated than how was your day, call me. Because things can degenerate so fast over text. They truly can. And on my end and the other person's end, I'm not saying I'm what's the term? Checking against myself or
Hedging your bet.
Hedging against my own problems, let's say, in terms of texting and the lack of nuance that can go with that.
Yeah.
So no, you're pointing out again that it's not a perfect means of communication, but we're also kind of stuck with it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is part of the point, is that
Mm-hmm.
we're stuck with this as the de facto town square. So what do we do with it?
Yeah.
And that is kind of the question. And you can either try to go along the lines of trying to censor opinions that you disagree with. And here's another bit of nuance that I think is important to inject. Opinions about what is right and wrong in moral have shifted dramatically over the past 50, 100 years, over the past 10 years. This is something that people don't fully realize, and Elon Musk actually put out a graphic or a meme about this. But the political leanings of the Democratic Party of, let's say the Clintons and the party platform of 20 years ago of the Democrats is almost indistinguishable of the Republicans today. The polls have shifted hugely towards the left. The center has just gone straight left. So the Republicans have completely given up on fiscal responsibility. There's a number of issues. Barack Obama in 2008, talked to Rick Warren about the fact that he was in support of traditional marriage. That'd be a death sentence in the Democratic Party of today. So the point I'm trying to make, beyond the political point, is that things that are deemed morally correct or things that are deemed, right or wrong, they shift over time to a certain degree. And the more that we censor that process and that discourse, the more we run the risk of that exasperating, let's say. And we see this a lot in cancel culture today, and that people saying things 10, 20, 15 years ago are getting dragged up, not because people genuinely care about wanting them to have a reflection on their errors. It's all just because we just want to hate on someone. And these things are getting dragged up, and then people are getting, quote, canceled. Now you're part of the deplorables, let's say. And it's a stupid game. It's a really, really dumb game. And this mob mentality is a really dumb game. But that's, in some sense, a whole separate issue. But it all ties in here.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to quick bring it up. And one other thing I want to point out is that one of the key things that Musk has talked about that he wants to change is that Twitter's algorithm, in terms of what it promotes and what it censors and how content is put on your feed, how content is promoted, etc. That is an open source, and it's one of the big complaints from a lot of people is that they don't understand the rules of Twitter and why exactly their content is getting either demoted or the opposite, and is getting pushed upward in the algorithm. And then on top of that, these algorithms are designed to get essentially as many clicks as possible. And one of the issues with that is that content that is inflammatory, content that is violent, negative content is promoted far more than positive content or nuanced content. So what you have is an algorithm that's actually promoting a more negative, violent, aggressive view of things than actually is true. So it's this giant issue where you have a minority of people on a platform. Of that minority, a minority are hyperactive and constitute the majority of tweets. And of those majority of tweets, the majority that gets promoted are all the violent, hateful, and crazy stuff that goes on. And then all of the regular people, all of the people, just working their 9 to 5, go on Twitter and see all of this crazy content that is not a true reflection of the world at all. And then it's just this cycle. So it's a very complicated problem, and it's all baked into the cake here, let's say. And I don't know what to do about it. That's for damn sure. But nonetheless, we have to factor that in this conversation, because to ignore it is to ignore what is that, how complicated this actually is.
Certainly.
And I don't think censoring that discussion is going to solve it, or censoring particular viewpoints about that discussion is going to solve it. Hence the point to free speech again.
Yeah. Assume the person you're speaking to knows
Know
something
that
you don't.
Precisely.
Because they definitely do.
Well, 100% they do.
So yeah, and this is where I'm gonna plug this podcast.
There we go.
Podcasts in general, because you could go on Twitter for a few hours and get a few hundred different bite-sized opinions that may or may not, probably won't be that nuanced. Or you can dive into different podcasts. There's so many, or read different books, or read articles. But I think that articles, podcasts, and books and talking to people are going to be so much more useful in your journey of learning and growing and forming an opinion about the world than scrolling on Twitter and hearing those comments and tweets that are so radical and crazy and loud. I don't know, you're going to learn so much more listening to this podcast and others like it. So that's kind of my plug here at the end. I don't know, what else do you want to say about this?
Well, to that exact same point is, we've talked about this a couple times, is one of the issues of Twitter is you get like 280 characters or whatever it is. Almost anything of value that's worth talking about simply cannot be expressed in 280 characters. It barely can be expressed in 10,000. So one of the things that I think is both humbling, useful, essential, frankly, is that you take complicated issues seriously. And one of the things that I've definitely noticed over the past 3 years is I went from thinking that I had a decent grasp of what was going on with certain issues, certain political issues, to realizing that I didn't know anything at all. And that doesn't mean that I'm not going to try and make a case for something. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to try and argue a point or, try to find out what's going on. I certainly am going to do so. But whenever I read a book about a complicated topic, and it can be such a small topic on its face, and then you read a book about it, and you realize, oh my word, I know nothing about this. It's like economics. Oh yeah, I understand economics.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, go read an intro to economics textbook. Go do that, and then see how much you know about economics. And it's immensely humbling, but it's actually essential. Mm-hmm. Because one of the issues with the platforms, as we've pointed out, is that they condense extremely complicated things to these little sound bites, to these little arguments that completely fail to take into account the actual complexity of the issue. So that's where podcasts comes in, that's where books come in, that's where actual conversations between people come in, which we should probably do more of these days.
Yeah.
We need more genuine conversations. Oh my word. So, exactly to your point. I'm totally with you. It's been reading books about the insane variety of topics that I've read about has just been so humbling and so useful. And also terrifying.
Yeah.
So
imagine if we put all of what we just said into a tweet. Well, how would you summarize it? I can't.
No. No, of course not. Of course not. You can't. It's too complex.
No. You could do tiny little bits out of different areas, but you're just not going to get the full picture. And,
no, you're not.
And even this podcast didn't even paint the full picture of the argument.
We barely scratched the surface.
We only had like a few little facts and just some thoughts and opinions. It's like, if I were you, I'd go and talk to people about it, see what you can learn from others, and get a bigger view of this issue. And that's what I'm going to keep doing because
certainly.
I still don't know that much.
It's so scary to go on this thing and talk about this. It's like, I probably said 50 things that are like borderline untrue.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, in the context of this being a complicated issue, we're trying to give opinions and, conclusions about things that, each subset of the things that we're talking about could be a podcast. And we mention this all the time. So, I try and take that to heart, while at the same time trying to give a genuine opinion But it's hard. It really is.
Mm-hmm.
It's everything's so complicated, and the only way that you would address something complicated is through long form discourse. It's absolutely essential. And even though Twitter is not the perfect place for that, we might as well try and make it as free and open as possible to facilitate that as well as we possibly can.
Yeah.
And I guess that's part of the big point here. Will Musk do that perfectly? Of course not. Of course not. Do I think he's going to try to make it more free and open? Certainly. Do I think he's going to try and make the rules and regulations of the platform more open so that both sides of the aisle can give their perspective? Certainly. As he said in one of his first tweets after buying Twitter, he wants his worst critics to stay on Twitter. And I hope they do. I really do. So,
yeah,
we'll see what happens.
And it's just final thing. This, like you said, it's so terrifying speaking in front of people.
Yeah.
And people may not like what they have to hear.
Oh, yeah.
But that's the beauty of free speech. If you think any of the things that we said are wrong or incorrect,
Fantastic.
Come tell me and tell Nate, because we'd love to learn where we could improve our mental map. And so each time I do a podcast, I feel like I've grown a little bit as a person. I'm like, man, this was so productive, and now I know that I could look into it a lot more, and my understanding of it is a little bit better, and I think people need to do this more. Not podcasting necessarily, but just talking with people in a genuine way, assuming that they know something that I don't, and being humble about what you do know. So I guess that's kind of one of the morals of this. Freedom of speech is super, super crucial.
Yeah. Yeah. We could just, chant that for the next hour.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Uh-huh.
No, you're exactly right. And it's terrifying to be wrong, but it's even more terrifying to live in a false reality.
And to be a sheep and so scared to say what is on your mind and just bow down to whatever the opinion of the masses is, and just, it's like, what life would you rather live? And
precisely. So, all right, we'll see what Elon does next.
Yeah, it'll be
It's an interesting reality we live in.
It's kind of history in the making.
Oh yeah,
it's crazy.
For certain. This definitely is. Sheesh. Didn't even exist a decade ago.
No.
That's the crazy part. All right.
Farewell, everyone.
Farewell.
Thanks for sticking around to the end of this episode. If you found this discussion meaningful or engaging, feel free to give me a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, comment on YouTube. Share this with your friends. If you found it meaningful, I'm sure they would too. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great rest of your day.